On a quiet night that should have ended like any other, a routine walk home turned into a mystery that would outlive an entire generation. No screams were heard. No witnesses stepped forward. And for nearly 3 decades, one question sat unanswered in police files and family memories alike. How does someone vanish from the ordinary without leaving a trace that speaks? Investigators chased dead ends, followed confident theories that collapsed under scrutiny, and watched time erase what evidence couldn't protect itself from. But cases don't stay silent forever. Sometimes they wait. Years later, a single overlooked detail, preserved by chance rather than certainty, would force detectives to reopen a file everyone thought was finished. What they found didn't just challenge the original investigation, it rewrote the timeline of what was possible. This is not a story about speed or luck. It's about patience, persistence, and how the smallest fragment can carry the weight of truth for decades. Detective Michael Hayes stepped into the small, dimly lit apartment on Spokane's east side. The air still heavy with the faint scent of late summer heat and dust. Papers lay scattered across the living room floor. But it was the quiet that struck him first. The kind of silence that presses against the chest and lingers even after the obvious chaos of a disappearance. On August 12, 1994, Emily Saunders, 26, had vanished from her home, leaving behind her daily routine, her journal, and the fragments of a life that, at first glance, appeared ordinary. Officer Robert Lane methodically photographed the rooms, noting small details. A coffee cup still half full on the kitchen counter, a jacket tossed carelessly over a chair, and a diary open on the bedside table. Detective Sarah Collins crouched beside the diary, her gloved fingers tracing entries that hinted at stress, minor anxieties, and fleeting mentions of a neighbor who had been overly persistent. These seemingly innocuous details would later become crucial threads in a narrative that had remained cold for nearly 3 decades. The initial missing persons report had been filed by Emily's younger brother, Thomas Saunders, who, upon returning from a work trip, found the apartment untouched yet devoid of its occupant. Linda Martinez, tasked with canvassing the immediate neighborhood, noted that several neighbors recalled seeing Emily leave for a brief walk in the late afternoon, but none had observed her return. There were inconsistencies. One neighbor claimed she had waved at a man near the corner store. Another said he hadn't noticed anyone. Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins began reconstructing the timeline, piecing together witness statements with the diary entries, and mapping the subtle patterns of Emily's last known movements. The immediate tension was not the result of a violent scene. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, only a life abruptly interrupted and the quiet questions left behind. Emily's personal habits, her dedication to her job at a local library, and her evening routines revealed a woman disciplined yet social, often sharing small dinners with her sister, calling her mother nightly, and documenting thoughts and doubts. Encounters in meticulous journal entries. These writings would become a silent yet persistent voice in the investigation, guiding the detectives as they noted small behavioral patterns. She often mentioned her route to the library, her interactions with neighbors, and minor irritations at local traffic or construction. Officer Lane, while photographing the exterior, noticed the front stoop's worn steps and the faint tire tracks leading from the driveway. Details that initially seemed insignificant, but later contributed to reconstructing a partial timeline of movements outside the apartment. The absence of Emily's personal items, her wallet, phone, and keys, suggested a hurried departure or a calculated removal by someone else. Detective Hayes methodically recorded these details in the case file, aware that the smallest inconsistencies could eventually unravel larger truths. The initial hours of the investigation were spent bridging gaps between physical evidence and human recollection, a painstaking process that required attention to patterns, contradictions, and emotional responses from witnesses. Linda Martinez followed up with family members, documenting routines and emotional responses, understanding that the context of grief and anxiety could affect statements yet also reveal hidden truths. Meanwhile, forensic analysis had begun in parallel. Though 1994 technology was limited, lab analysts Jennifer Cole, Mark Turner collected trace evidence from the apartment, preserving fibers, fingerprints, and any potential biological matter. At this point, the detectives faced the delicate balance of managing a high-stakes investigation while maintaining procedural integrity, sensitivity toward the family. The psychological weight of the case was immediate. The pressure to find Emily before time erased critical evidence, combined with the subtle fear that a neighbor or someone close to her could be involved, cast a shadow over every action taken. Michael Hayes, reviewing the collected data, noted that despite exhaustive canvassing and interviews, the timeline remained fragmented, and key moments in Emily's movements were undocumented, leaving room for uncertainty. The narrative began within the tension itself. A missing young woman, seemingly ordinary, whose disappearance revealed cracks in witness reliability, gaps in investigative protocols, and a city unaware of the enduring impact this event would carry. The detectives reconstructed possible paths she might have taken, considering environmental factors, traffic patterns, local construction, seasonal weather conditions, but each scenario remained speculative without corroborating evidence. Throughout this process, Sarah Collins emphasized context, urging that every statement and an observation be cross-referenced with physical evidence, while Michael Hayes focused on temporal sequencing and behavioral patterns. The diary entries were meticulously cataloged, with attention to dates, times, and interpersonal interactions, revealing subtle clues about her mental state, relationships, and daily routines. This combination of procedural rigor and human context became the foundation of the case, shaping every subsequent investigation phase. By the end of the first day, the detectives had mapped a preliminary timeline, identified potential witnesses, and secured all physical evidence, yet the core mystery remained. Where had Emily Saunders gone, and what forces, seen or unseen, had interrupted a life so carefully documented and rooted in routine? The immediate entry into the case, framed by methodical observation and psychological context, established a narrative tension that would guide all further inquiry, detailing not only the disappearance itself, but also the procedural diligence required to understand and ultimately resolve a case that would remain cold for 28 years. The atmosphere was methodical yet heavy, the detectives acutely aware that every overlooked detail, every seemingly insignificant diary entry, could hold the key to unraveling an intricate story of absence, evidence, and human persistence, marking the start of a decades-long pursuit for truth. Spokane in the summer of 1994 was quiet in a way that made absences more noticeable, and for the Saunders family, Emily's disappearance rippled through every corner of their lives. Context revealed itself not through immediate evidence alone, but through the consequences of a life abruptly interrupted. Thomas Saunders, Emily's younger brother, returned from a business trip to find his sister gone and the apartment untouched yet echoing with absence. Their mother, Helen Saunders, described Emily as a careful, thoughtful young woman, someone who planned her days meticulously, rarely missing her nightly calls home or her weekend visits with her family. This structured life made the sudden disappearance all the more alarming. Detective Sarah Collins conducted multiple interviews with neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, noting how each description of Emily aligned with her diaries, friendly but reserved, conscientious about her surroundings, and cautious in interactions with strangers. Some neighbors described small but persistent interactions with an unfamiliar man loitering near the neighborhood, a detail dismissed in the initial investigation as inconsequential, yet later it would gain weight in the context of Emily's routine. Emily worked at a local library, a role she cherished, and coworkers confirmed her punctuality and quiet demeanor, often helping patrons meticulously and spending late evenings organizing community programs. Her absence was first noted by her supervisor, who described the uncharacteristic nature of Emily not showing up or calling, marking the first break in her otherwise predictable routine. This disruption extended beyond the physical. The psychological effect on the community and family created a pressure point in which every small observation gained significance. Detective Michael Hayes and Officer Lane mapped Emily's daily patterns, reconstructing her routes between home, the library, and local errands, creating a detailed temporal and spatial profile. These reconstructions highlighted the gaps left by a lack of eyewitness clarity and the limitations of contemporaneous investigative methods. The diary, now central to the case, provided insights into her routines, minor concerns, and personal reflections, often noting small neighborhood interactions, peculiar behaviors of passersby, and observations of those who lingered too long near her home. Linda Martinez compiled these contextual details alongside physical evidence, ensuring a comprehensive view of Emily's life and the social environment she navigated. By examining the consequences of her absence, the missed calls, the uncollected mail, the unanswered inquiries, detectives began to understand the broader picture of Emily's world and how her disappearance disrupted it. Subtle inconsistencies in neighbor statements emerged, including conflicting recollections of who had been seen on the street and when, which initially seemed trivial, but later provided critical points for cross-referencing with diary entries and known schedules. The team also reviewed local police records, identifying minor incidents, complaints, and reports from the area surrounding Emily's apartment, which offered further context for risk assessment. Every interaction, every observation was cataloged meticulously. Times, locations, and social connections were layered to reconstruct the network around Emily's life. Even routine activities, like her trips to the grocery store or evening walks, gained investigative relevance when cross-checked against witness statements and temporal data. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts monitored these developments, noting how context shaped legal evaluation and potential leads without venturing into speculation. They emphasized that understanding the environment, routines, and relational dynamics of Emily's life was essential before drawing any conclusions about culpability or motive. The immediate consequences of her absence extended into the emotional domain as well. Friends reported anxiety and distress at her unexplained disappearance, some noticing patterns of people avoiding certain streets or interactions that Emily herself had previously noted in her diaries. These human responses, combined with methodical detective work, created a map not just of her movements but of the social and emotional landscape impacted by the event. Even minor details, her favorite coffee shop left unopened, a book she intended to borrow returned late, were documented, revealing the subtle fractures her disappearance introduced into everyday life. Over time, as detectives layered these contextual details, they began to see how a single life, carefully structured and observed, intersected with broader social patterns and the imperfections of neighborhood awareness. Each observation, whether from diary, witness, or physical evidence, contributed to a growing understanding of Emily Saunders not as a case file, but as a living individual whose routines, decisions, and interactions defined both her vulnerability and her presence in the community. By examining these consequences carefully, the team established a framework for all subsequent investigative steps, identifying inconsistencies, missed leads, and overlooked behavioral patterns that would later become critical in unraveling the decades-long mystery. The context of Emily's life revealed through her habits, the responses of those around her, and the subtle shifts in daily routines caused by her absence painted a picture of normalcy disrupted, highlighting both the human cost of her disappearance and the investigative urgency that would eventually drive the case forward. This focus on consequences, rather than speculation, allowed the procedural team to maintain clarity and direction, emphasizing factual reconstruction while preserving the humanity of the victim and the reliability of their investigative methods. Emily Saunders was more than the absence that defined her family's nights in 1994. She was a constellation of habits, thoughts, and relationships that painted a picture of a young woman deeply embedded in her community. At 26, she lived independently in Spokane, balancing a demanding job at the local library with close family ties and a circle of friends who trusted her judgment and reliability. Her mornings were regimented. She prepared breakfast for herself and occasionally her younger brother Thomas, who often stayed over when errands required it. She kept her apartment meticulously organized, with her diary always within reach, a notebook of observations, reflections, and personal commentary that would later provide a crucial lens into her life. Emily had a calm presence in social situations, known to colleagues for her patience when helping library patrons and her attentiveness to detail when cataloging rare texts. She regularly attended evening book clubs, enjoyed walks around the neighborhood, and often visited local coffee shops where she was recognized by name. Her diaries revealed a thoughtful mind, noting small interactions with neighbors, reflections on her work, and concerns that were ordinary yet precise. A neighbor's loud music, a streetlight left on late, an unfamiliar man she passed during her evening walks. These entries showed Emily as observant, cautious, and deeply aware of her surroundings. Friends described her as empathetic and responsible, someone who rarely missed a commitment and whose absence immediately drew concern. Detective Sarah Collins, when reviewing these entries, emphasized that understanding Emily as a living person was central to reconstructing the circumstances of her disappearance. Her routines, choices, and personality traits were as important as physical evidence. The investigators cataloged her social interactions, noting patterns of trust and vigilance, relationships with family members, and her tendency to notice minor anomalies in daily life. Officer Linda Martinez interviewed coworkers and neighbors, reinforcing the portrait of a meticulous, considerate individual whose predictability contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of her vanishing. Emily's personal habits also included meticulous record-keeping, both in her professional work and private life, which later provided the investigative team with a timeline that might otherwise have been lost. Her diet, exercise routines, and personal projects reflected a woman organized and deliberate, often planning weeks in advance and documenting events, appointments, and concerns with care. Detective Michael Hayes considered how these details shaped vulnerability and exposure. A disciplined routine could limit risk in some ways, yet the very predictability might have made her movements more trackable to someone observing her. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner later cross-referenced diary observations with physical evidence, confirming that entries aligned with the known locations and habits of Emily, providing a baseline of normalcy against which deviations were examined. Her family, particularly her younger brother Thomas, described her as a supportive sibling who often mediated small disputes, organized family gatherings, and maintained close communication with her mother, Helen Saunders. These relationships, grounded in mutual trust, were affected immediately by her absence. Each missed call or unkept plan became a tangible reminder of the disruption caused by her disappearance. The portrait of Emily as a living person extended beyond her immediate household. She was recognized in the community for volunteering at local events and participating in library outreach programs. She had a network of friends who trusted her judgment and often sought her advice, highlighting her role as an engaged and conscientious member of Spokane society. Detective Hayes noted that portraying her life fully was not only a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for the investigation. Understanding her as more than a missing individual allowed the team to identify patterns, contextualize witness statements, and anticipate potential investigative leads. The diaries provided subtle insights into her concerns about safety, observations about neighbors, and reflections on minor confrontations or unsettling interactions. While none of these entries indicated imminent danger, they highlighted Emily's awareness of her environment and her methodical approach to daily life. The procedural team compiled all these details, integrating them into the timeline, mapping locations, and identifying the network of relationships that would later assist in verifying leads, corroborating evidence, and understanding the context of her disappearance. Emily Saunders, as reconstructed through careful analysis, emerged not as a passive subject of investigation, but as a fully realized individual whose routines, personality, and interactions informed every aspect of the case. Recognizing her as a living person allowed investigators to approach the case with both rigor and empathy, ensuring that every procedural step remained anchored in reality, guided by evidence, and respectful of her life. By creating this detailed, human-centered portrait, the detectives established a foundation for subsequent investigative phases, linking behavioral patterns, social context, and environmental awareness to the gaps and anomalies that would eventually illuminate the truth behind a disappearance that remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. By mid-August 1994, the routine that had defined Emily Saunders' life had been shattered, and the risks surrounding her disappearance began to escalate in ways that were not immediately visible to the initial investigation team. The detectives, Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins, reviewed each timeline, noting gaps in witness observations and contradictions in neighbor accounts, which suggested that someone may have been watching or tracking Emily's movements without raising alarm at the time. Small anomalies, such as a neighbor's conflicting statement about seeing an unfamiliar man near her apartment, and subtle changes in street activity reported by multiple residents, were flagged as potential indicators of risk. Officer Robert Lane canvassed the neighborhood repeatedly, noting patterns in pedestrian and vehicle traffic that had previously been dismissed as ordinary. Meanwhile, Officer Linda Martinez focused on the community context, understanding that fear, rumor, and anxiety could influence what people reported or omitted. These early observations revealed the escalation of risk, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as an insidious accumulation of small, overlooked details that, when combined, suggested vulnerability. Emily's own diary entries, once considered personal reflections, took on heightened significance. Subtle mentions of discomfort with a particular neighbor's attention, and brief notes about feeling followed during evening walks, though innocuous in isolation, gained new weight in the context of her disappearance. The investigators cross-referenced these entries with surveillance of the local area, traffic patterns, and known presence of transient individuals in the vicinity, building a picture of a network of environmental and social factors that could have contributed to her exposure. Michael Hayes emphasized to the team that escalation of risk was often incremental, the result of cumulative pressures and unrecognized threats rather than sudden violence. He reviewed entries with lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner, who confirmed that trace evidence collected at the apartment, including fibers and unidentified DNA, was consistent with multiple possible contacts, reinforcing the idea that Emily had encountered an unknown individual prior to vanishing. Detectives also considered behavioral patterns. Emily's structured routine made her predictable, yet her awareness of minor disturbances in her neighborhood indicated she exercised caution, which suggested that whoever intervened had both opportunity and calculated timing. The combination of overlooked neighbor statements, diary entries, and environmental observations allowed the procedural team to reconstruct subtle risk factors that the initial investigation had not prioritized, revealing that the danger was not visible in immediate physical confrontation, but embedded in patterns and interactions that required careful synthesis to detect. Sarah Collins coordinated interviews with friends and coworkers to identify any recent deviations from Emily's normal routine, such as missed appointments or unusual behavior, while documenting emotional responses that could hint at previously unreported concerns. Each piece of information, from her favorite coffee shop interactions to minor observations about foot traffic in her residential street, contributed to the understanding that the risk surrounding her life was both real and cumulative, emerging gradually in the days leading up to her disappearance. By analyzing these incremental indicators, the detectives created a framework to understand how a young woman, careful, observant, and conscientious, could still become vulnerable in an environment that appeared familiar and safe. Officer Lane and Martinez reviewed environmental and spatial data, noting points of access, blind spots in public surveillance, and the times when Emily's predictable movements intersected with unverified individuals, further highlighting the subtle escalation of risk. The procedural team recognized that understanding these dynamics was essential for both reconstructing events and guiding future investigative efforts. The intersection of environmental factors, human behavior, and overlooked social interactions revealed a narrative of mounting vulnerability rather than overt confrontation, a critical distinction that framed the remainder of the investigation. Each investigative step was measured, deliberate, and rooted in observed facts, reinforcing the reality that escalation of risk in this case was both a matter of circumstance and timing. By the close of this phase, the detectives had mapped the potential points of exposure, integrated the diary insights, and established a nuanced understanding of how Emily Saunders' disappearance could occur despite her caution, awareness, and the seemingly ordinary safety of her surroundings. This meticulous reconstruction of escalating risk not only guided immediate investigative decisions, but also established the foundation for understanding the crime itself, ensuring that subsequent procedural steps were informed by a comprehensive, evidence-based view of vulnerability rather than assumption or speculation, preserving clarity, accuracy, and respect for the victim at every turn. The day Emily Saunders disappeared culminated in a crime that, at first glance, left few overt traces but, under careful scrutiny, revealed a pattern that investigators would unravel over decades. Detective Michael Hayes and Detective Sarah Collins approached the reconstruction of the incident with methodical precision, aware that the absence of a violent scene did not equate to the absence of a crime. The apartment remained orderly, possessions untouched beyond the essentials Emily carried, but minor anomalies drew their attention. A faint scuff near the doorway, an unlocked window with no evidence of forced entry, and traces of unidentified fibers collected by Officer Robert Lane from the carpet near the living room. These details, initially subtle, formed the foundation for understanding the crime itself. Emily's last confirmed movements were reconstructed from her diary and witness statements. She had left the apartment in the late afternoon, intending a brief walk to the corner store, a routine she had followed countless times before. Yet, inconsistencies in neighbor reports suggested the presence of an unknown individual along her path. Some described a man standing near the intersection, seemingly waiting or observing. Others claimed to have seen a vehicle parked unusually long in the street. These observations were logged, cross-referenced, and mapped against Emily's known trajectory, highlighting potential points where opportunity intersected with vulnerability. Detective Collins focused on behavioral reconstruction, identifying that Emily, cautious by nature, would likely have avoided interactions unless unavoidable, implying that whoever intervened had sufficient knowledge of her routines or relied on situational advantage. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner analyzed the trace evidence collected from the apartment and nearby surroundings, noting fibers that did not match Emily's clothing, partial DNA profiles, and minute skin cells consistent with incidental contact. Though inconclusive at the time, these findings were meticulously catalogued and preserved, understanding that advances in technology could later render them decisive. Officer Linda Martinez documented the environmental context, detailing lighting, sightlines, and neighborhood layout, emphasizing how ordinary urban features, fences, parked cars, shadowed alleyways, could facilitate the commission of a crime without leaving immediate evidence of struggle. The procedural team reconstructed a timeline, integrating witness statements, diary entries, and environmental data, concluding that the crime likely occurred during Emily's predictable route home or near the perimeter of her building. Every decision was informed by this methodical reconstruction: photographs of the apartment, measurements of entry points, and assessment of nearby escape routes contributed to a comprehensive understanding of the scene. Emily's personal habits were considered in detail: her tendency to carry only essentials, her predictable walking schedule, and her awareness of neighbors' patterns suggested that the crime exploited these elements rather than relying on chance. Detectives examined similar incidents in the area and consulted historical police reports, identifying that while no immediate link existed, patterns of opportunistic targeting were consistent with the environmental factors present during her disappearance. The absence of immediate witnesses added complexity, but the investigative team used indirect evidence to build a factual reconstruction. The combination of physical traces, environmental factors, and behavioral context allowed the detectives to outline plausible scenarios, which they would later test against forensic evidence and witness corroboration. Throughout this phase, the procedural team maintained a strict focus on observable facts, avoiding speculation or dramatization, recognizing that the clarity of the investigative record was essential for eventual legal proceedings. The crime itself, while silent in its immediate manifestation, revealed layers of interaction, opportunity, and calculated timing that underscored both the challenges of the initial investigation and the eventual path toward resolution. By the end of the crime reconstruction phase, detectives had established a clear, evidence-based narrative of what had occurred. Emily Saunders, on her routine path home, encountered an unknown individual whose presence intersected with her predictable movements, culminating in her disappearance. This reconstruction, built from physical evidence, diary entries, witness statements, and environmental analysis, provided the foundation for the subsequent investigation, legal review, and eventual forensic breakthroughs. Every element was preserved with procedural rigor, creating a roadmap not only of the incident itself, but of the context in which the crime could occur, ensuring that the narrative remained grounded in fact, analytical in approach, and centered on Emily as a living individual whose absence reverberated through both her family and the investigative team. The initial investigation into Emily Saunders' disappearance unfolded with a meticulous, if ultimately limited, procedural rigor. Led by Detective Michael Hayes and Detective Sarah Collins, supported closely by Officers Robert Lane and Linda Martinez. From the first day, their focus was on reconstructing her movements, canvassing the neighborhood, and gathering witness statements. But the fragmented nature of recollections presented immediate challenges. Lane and Martinez conducted door-to-door interviews, documenting not only the content of each account, but also the subtle emotional cues, inconsistencies, and potential memory distortions inherent in recollections of a seemingly ordinary day. Witnesses offered conflicting observations. One neighbor recalled seeing Emily leaving for her walk. Another insisted she passed by a different street corner at an unusual hour. And a third mentioned a vehicle idling suspiciously in proximity to her usual path. Collins emphasized that while no single statement was conclusive, these contradictions created patterns worth exploring. The detectives compiled detailed maps of Emily's routine, overlaying known times, diary entries, and neighbor observations to identify potential points where she could have been intercepted or observed. Meanwhile, Officer Lane photographed and measured environmental features, including entryways, sidewalks, street lighting, and obscured vantage points that could influence both her exposure and the likelihood of unnoticed approach by another individual. All collected physical evidence, from fingerprints to trace fibers in the apartment, was carefully bagged and logged by lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner, who noted both the limitations of 1994 forensic methods and the potential value of preserving materials for future analysis. Their meticulous documentation ensured that even subtle clues, fragments of DNA too degraded for immediate profiling, stray fibers, or latent prints, remained available for re-evaluation. Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins also reviewed regional crime reports, searching for incidents that might correlate with Emily's disappearance, identifying patterns of opportunistic predation or minor break-ins that, while not directly connected, contextualized potential risk. The detectives approached family interactions with measured empathy, balancing the need for information with sensitivity. Interviews with Emily's mother, Helen Saunders, and her brother Thomas revealed behavioral consistencies, habitual routines, and the psychological impact of her absence, all of which were critical in reconstructing timelines and verifying entries in her personal diary. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts began preliminary evaluations, ensuring that investigative steps adhered to legal standards and documenting each action to preserve future prosecutorial integrity. They emphasized the importance of accuracy over assumption, stressing that witness memory is inherently imperfect and must be cross-referenced with tangible evidence whenever possible. As the investigation progressed, the team faced logistical challenges, incomplete surveillance coverage, the absence of digital communication records, and limited forensic technology constrained immediate breakthroughs. These limitations demanded that procedural diligence, attention to detail, and methodical cross-referencing guide every step. Despite these obstacles, the detectives documented each layer, mapping potential intersections between Emily's observed routines and areas of opportunity that could facilitate the crime. Officer Martinez supplemented this work by gathering environmental photographs, noting temporal patterns of street activity, and identifying features that could obscure or reveal movements of people in the vicinity. All collected data was synthesized in daily briefings, allowing the team to compare entries, highlight contradictions, and prioritize leads with the highest evidentiary potential. While immediate conclusions were impossible, these initial investigative steps laid the groundwork for later forensic breakthroughs and the eventual resolution of the case. The procedural emphasis on thorough documentation, methodical interviews, and environmental assessment ensured that each detail, no matter how minor, was preserved, creating a factual backbone for the investigation. The interplay between diary entries, witness statements, and physical evidence formed a complex mosaic that the detectives continued to refine. Aware that understanding the initial investigation in its entirety was critical to evaluating overlooked leads and assessing risk factors. By the end of this phase, the Cold Case Unit had a comprehensive baseline, a detailed reconstruction of Emily Saunders' last known movements, extensive documentation of environmental conditions, and a meticulous catalog of evidence and statements that would later enable modern forensic analysis to identify inconsistencies, validate observations, and ultimately connect the crime to its perpetrator. This disciplined approach ensured that the investigation maintained clarity, procedural integrity, and a victim-centered focus, preserving both the factual record and the human story at the core of the case. As the investigation into Emily Saunders' disappearance evolved, the legal process became an essential parallel track, ensuring that every piece of collected evidence was preserved, documented, and evaluated in a manner consistent with prosecutorial standards. Prosecutor Daniel Hayes took the lead on reviewing the case file, meticulously examining the reports from detectives Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins, the field notes from officers Robert Lane and Linda Martinez, and the preliminary forensic findings provided by lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner. Each document was assessed not only for content, but also for procedural integrity, verifying that chain of custody protocols had been strictly maintained and that no evidence had been contaminated or improperly recorded. Emily Roberts, serving as co-prosecutor, focused on the admissibility and weight of testimonial evidence, cross-referencing statements from neighbors, co-workers, and family members with the physical evidence to determine coherence, reliability, and investigative significance. The prosecutors were acutely aware that witness memory is inherently fallible, especially when recalling seemingly minor events from ordinary days, and emphasized that contradictions must be evaluated with context, not conjecture. Legal evaluation also required the mapping of environmental and temporal data against the statutory definitions of criminal acts, ensuring that any future charges could be supported unequivocally by fact rather than inference. The early-stage review highlighted several procedural strengths: the detective's comprehensive documentation of the apartment, Emily's diary entries, environmental observations, and careful recording of minor anomalies provided a foundation that met evidentiary standards. Simultaneously, the review identified gaps that could later be addressed through modern forensic methods, such as DNA testing and trace evidence analysis, which at the time had been limited by technological constraints. Prosecutors coordinated with the investigative team to ensure that follow-up interviews and evidence collection adhered strictly to ethical and legal standards, maintaining a chain of information that would withstand scrutiny in court. They advised on how to phrase questions to witnesses and family members to minimize leading statements, and they monitored the collection of any new evidence to guarantee that procedures aligned with both local and federal legal requirements. Each step of the legal process was informed by a commitment to victim-centered principles. Emily Saunders' life, relationships, and routines were considered integral to contextualizing evidence and establishing narrative coherence, rather than serving as a backdrop for speculative theory. In preparing for eventual court proceedings, prosecutors documented potential challenges, such as inconsistencies in neighbor testimony, temporal gaps in Emily's last known movements, and the limitations of 1994 forensic technology, ensuring that all known variables were accounted for and presented with transparency. The procedural focus extended to family interactions, as the prosecutors guided detectives in managing communications with Emily's mother and brother, recognizing the necessity of empathy, clarity in relaying investigative updates while avoiding premature conclusions or assurances. Legal oversight also involved the evaluation of potential suspects, emphasizing that procedural fairness and adherence to evidence-based reasoning were paramount. The team refrained from speculation, relying exclusively on trace evidence, diary corroboration, and verified witness statements to establish relevance. The coordination between investigators and prosecutors allowed for a layered approach. Field observations and forensic data informed legal assessments, while prosecutorial guidance ensured that every investigative action maintained evidentiary integrity and met ethical standards. By systematically documenting the legal process alongside investigative steps, the team established a clear, procedural narrative that could later support indictments, trials, or other judicial outcomes. The careful integration of legal review ensured that the case maintained credibility, clarity, and accountability, preserving the chain of evidence and the rights of all parties while maintaining focus on Emily Saunders' life and the consequences of her disappearance. Through this disciplined approach, the prosecutors created a framework in which future forensic breakthroughs, including reanalysis of biological evidence and modern DNA techniques, could be seamlessly integrated into the case file, enabling the pursuit of justice decades after the crime. Ultimately, the legal process phase solidified the foundational integrity of the investigation, ensuring that every procedural decision, every evidentiary link, and every investigative step adhered to standards capable of withstanding both judicial scrutiny and public accountability, while keeping the victim at the center of the narrative. As the investigation deepened, the procedural team began confronting a web of conflicting evidence that complicated the pursuit of clarity and slowed progress in the initial stages of the case. Witness statements, while carefully documented, revealed subtle but significant contradictions. One neighbor insisted she saw Emily leave her apartment at precisely 4:15 p.m., while another recalled her passing by a different intersection nearly 30 minutes later, creating a discrepancy that detectives Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins could not immediately reconcile. Officer Linda Martinez noted that minor details, such as descriptions of clothing or accessories, varied between accounts, reflecting the inherent unreliability of memory under everyday conditions. These inconsistencies extended beyond eyewitness observations. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner reviewed trace evidence collected at the scene, including unidentified fibers and partial DNA profiles, but the technology available in 1994 was insufficient to produce definitive matches. Fibers recovered from Emily's apartment partially matched materials from her workplace, yet traces found on the exterior steps suggested contact with a third party, though it could not be linked conclusively to any individual at the time. Detective Hayes recognized that these contradictions did not indicate negligence, but highlighted the natural limits of both human perception and forensic capacity at the time. Even the diary entries, previously central to constructing her daily routine, contained ambiguities, brief mentions of neighborhood observations and interactions with acquaintances sometimes conflicted with witness recollections or lacked precise temporal markers, making correlation with external events challenging. The procedural team documented these conflicts meticulously, establishing a chain of cross-referenced evidence that preserved the integrity of every divergent account. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts reviewed these inconsistencies to ensure that any legal assessment accounted for gaps, without resorting to speculation. They noted that while contradictions complicated the narrative, they also offered opportunities. Patterns of divergence could highlight moments of heightened risk, areas requiring further investigation, or individuals whose observations warranted additional scrutiny. The team conducted repeated re-interviews with neighbors and co-workers, carefully framing questions to avoid introducing bias while seeking clarification on overlapping or conflicting statements. Officers Lay and Martinez also revisited environmental context, reassessing street layouts, sightlines, and lighting to determine whether discrepancies in observations might be explained by physical obstructions or differing vantage points. Detective Collins emphasized that conflicting evidence must always be presented transparently, noting both what was known and what remained uncertain, a principle central to maintaining investigative credibility. At the laboratory, Jennifer Cole implemented meticulous protocols to document sample conditions, noting degradation over time, possible contamination, and limitations inherent in early DNA profiling methods. Partial results were preserved alongside procedural notes detailing testing conditions, ensuring that future technological advances could be applied without compromising chain of custody or reliability. The interplay of conflicting witness statements, ambiguous diary references, and partial forensic data created a layered challenge. Each piece of evidence was valid within its context. Yet the contradictions prevented the team from forming definitive conclusions without additional corroboration. This necessitated a systematic, evidence-based approach in which every anomaly was logged, every inconsistency analyzed, and every plausible explanation considered, yet no assumption was allowed to supplant verifiable fact. Over time, these conflicts would become crucial in the eventual reinvestigation. Previously overlooked discrepancies guided the cold case unit toward new lines of inquiry, highlighting areas where modern DNA testing and forensic genealogy could clarify uncertainties. The procedural team maintained meticulous records, ensuring that the conflicting evidence, rather than being a barrier, became an asset in reconstructing Emily Saunders' final movements and interactions. By treating contradictions as data rather than obstacles, the investigators preserved analytical integrity, strengthened the narrative's reliability, demonstrating that even in the presence of imperfect or conflicting evidence, methodical, fact-based investigation could illuminate the truth. Every documented conflict, cross-check statement, and ambiguous finding contributed to a comprehensive evidentiary map, ultimately serving as the foundation for breakthroughs that would resolve a case that had remained cold for 28 years, underscoring the importance of transparency, procedural rigor, and disciplined analysis in complex homicide investigations. Years after Emily Saunders' disappearance, the case remained unresolved, quietly lingering in the Spokane Police Department archives, until renewed investigative techniques prompted a formal reinvestigation that would ultimately unravel the decades-old mystery. In 2022, the Cold Case Unit, led by Detective Michael Hayes and Detective Sarah Collins, reopened the file following a persistent petition from Emily's brother, Thomas Saunders, who had independently preserved her diaries and personal effects for decades. The procedural team began by reviewing the entirety of the original investigation, noting areas where forensic technology had been limited and witness statements had conflicted, carefully cataloging every preserved fiber, fingerprint, and partial DNA sample. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner re-examined the biological evidence using modern DNA profiling techniques, achieving sensitivity and accuracy far beyond what was possible in 1994. These retests revealed previously undetectable genetic material, which, when analyzed through forensic genealogy, provided a link to a suspect outside the original investigation pool. Detectives meticulously cross-referenced this lead with archival witness statements, environmental data, and diary entries, identifying correlations between previously ambiguous observations and the suspect's known movements. The reinvestigation also involved revisiting inconsistent neighbor statements, now contextualized within timelines refined by modern analysis. Officer Linda Martinez and Officer Robert Lane conducted fresh interviews, comparing decades-old recollections to documented timelines and behavioral patterns, identifying subtle consistencies previously overlooked. The Cold Case Unit worked closely with prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts to ensure that every procedural step adhered to legal standards, preserving evidentiary integrity and maintaining victim-centered focus. Once a suspect was identified, DNA evidence obtained through secondary familial linkage was confronted with the individual, resulting in a confession that aligned precisely with the forensic and circumstantial evidence reconstructed over decades. The reinvestigation emphasized methodical synthesis, diary entries, environmental context, trace evidence, and historical inconsistencies were integrated into a coherent narrative demonstrating opportunity, access, and action without speculation. This approach allowed the procedural team to construct a precise timeline of the crime, establish motive rooted in proximity, circumstance, and present a factual evidence-driven account suitable for prosecution. The reinvestigation phase highlighted both the evolution of investigative science and the enduring value of meticulous documentation, demonstrating how initial procedural rigor, though limited by the technology of the 1990s, enabled breakthroughs when combined with modern methods. Emily Saunders' life, carefully documented through diaries, witness recollections, and routine patterns, guided each step, ensuring that the investigation remained grounded in human context rather than conjecture. The Cold Case Unit's efforts ultimately brought closure to a family that had carried uncertainty for 28 years, validating the importance of persistence, technological advancement, and methodical analytical work in resolving complex, long-standing cases. By systematically re-examining evidence, confronting inconsistencies, and integrating new insights, the team demonstrated that even decades-old unsolved crimes could yield to disciplined investigation, reaffirming both procedural integrity and the centrality of the victim's humanity in the pursuit of justice. The reinvestigation not only solved the crime, but illuminated the painstaking process required to reconcile historical limitations with modern forensic capabilities, providing a comprehensive resolution built on transparency, methodical rigor, and unwavering adherence to fact-based inquiry. Every piece of evidence, every preserved statement, and every previously overlooked anomaly contributed to reconstructing the full narrative, culminating in a closure that was both factual and deeply meaningful to the family and the broader community. This phase of the case underscored that reinvestigation, when conducted with discipline, modern science, and procedural fidelity, could transform uncertainty into clarity, ensuring that decades of unresolved questions were answered in a manner consistent with both justice and respect for the victim. The reinvestigation of Emily Saunders' case also brought into sharp focus the systemic limitations that had constrained the initial inquiry and shaped the trajectory of the investigation for decades. In 1994, forensic technology was capable but far from comprehensive, limiting the ability to process trace DNA, analyze degraded biological samples, or cross-reference genetic information in a meaningful way. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner documented these limitations carefully, noting that the partial DNA profiles and unidentified fibers collected from Emily's apartment could not be definitively matched to any individual at the time. Investigators faced additional challenges inherent in human memory. Witness recollections were fragmentary, inconsistent, and often influenced by the passage of time, environmental distractions, or personal perception. Detective Michael Hayes emphasized that the investigative techniques of the era relied heavily on physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, which, while methodical, were vulnerable to gaps and oversights that could obscure critical details. Neighborhood interviews were further complicated by social factors, including fear of retribution, desire to avoid police interaction, or simple uncertainty about what constituted relevant information, resulting in statements that were often partial or contradictory. Procedural documentation was thorough but constrained by analog record-keeping systems. Maps, photographs, and typed reports had to be manually cross-referenced, increasing the risk of overlooked connections. Furthermore, legal frameworks at the time limited the collection of certain types of evidence, including early forms of genetic testing, which would not have been permissible or feasible in routine investigation. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts noted that while investigative rigor was present, systemic constraints in technology, data management, and legal precedent created unavoidable blind spots that delayed resolution. Even the preservation of evidence was subject to archival limitations. Environmental controls for biological samples were less advanced, and long-term storage often risked degradation, complicating later forensic analysis. Emily's diaries, though preserved by her family, were not systematically integrated into initial procedural frameworks, representing another form of limitation in linking personal context to investigative action. Social and dietary. Cultural factors also influenced the investigation. Norms of the era affected both the attention given to young women living alone and the prioritization of missing person cases within departmental resources. All of these constraints underscored that the initial investigation, while diligent and conscientious, operated within a framework that inherently limited its capacity for immediate resolution. The reinvestigation highlighted the ways in which modern forensic methods, digital record-keeping, and procedural refinements could address these historical gaps, allowing previously ambiguous or unmatchable evidence to yield definitive results. Detective Sarah Collins reflected that understanding systemic limitations was not an exercise in assigning blame, but a necessary step in evaluating both the successes and gaps of the investigative process. By documenting these constraints transparently, the Cold Case Unit ensured that the eventual resolution could be understood in context, emphasizing how the combination of technological advancement, methodological rigor, and persistence overcame historical barriers. Recognizing these limitations also informed broader procedural lessons. Future investigations could benefit from integrating environmental, social, and technological factors from the outset, reducing the risk of overlooked evidence or delayed justice. Ultimately, systemic limitations shaped the course of Emily Saunders' case for decades, but they also highlighted the resilience of procedural diligence, the enduring value of meticulous documentation, and the capacity of modern science to correct gaps left by the constraints of the past. Through careful analysis of these limitations, the investigative team not only solved a long-standing mystery, but also demonstrated the importance of transparency, procedural fidelity, and evidence-based innovation in ensuring that justice could be achieved even decades after a crime. This reflection on systemic constraints underscored how the evolution of investigative practices, when combined with persistent attention to detail, could transform unresolved cases into definitive fact-based resolutions, reinforcing both accountability and trust in the investigative process. The long-term impact of Emily Saunders' disappearance extended far beyond the immediate shock and grief experienced by her family, reaching into the procedural, social, and emotional spheres of the Spokane community over nearly 3 decades. Her absence shaped the daily lives of those closest to her. Her mother, Helen Saunders, lived with persistent uncertainty, meticulously preserving Emily's personal effects, diaries, and photographs in the hope that one day answers would emerge. Thomas Saunders, her younger brother, carried the dual weight of loss and responsibility, actively maintaining records, reviewing the original investigation files, and advocating tirelessly for the case to be reopened. This sustained involvement by family members was pivotal, not only in preserving critical evidence but also in ensuring institutional attention remained on a case that might otherwise have faded into archival obscurity. The prolonged, unresolved status of Emily's case also affected law enforcement practices, illustrating the importance of meticulous documentation and long-term evidence preservation. Detectives Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins, along with officers Robert Lane and Linda Martinez, reflected on how the initial investigative rigor, even within the technological and systemic limitations of the 1990s, provided a foundation for eventual breakthroughs. The Cold Case Unit's decision to reopen the investigation in 2022 demonstrated how advances in forensic science, combined with preserved evidence and detailed procedural records, could finally transform ambiguity into resolution. On a community level, the disappearance and eventual resolution of Emily Saunders' case reinforced awareness around neighborhood safety, engagement with law enforcement, and the importance of reporting unusual activity, however minor it may seem at the time. Emily's colleagues and friends experienced a long-term psychological impact as well, balancing the memory of her absence with the eventual relief of closure. A reminder that unresolved cases leave enduring emotional imprints that persist even after factual resolution. The legal system also reflected on the procedural lessons offered by this case. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts highlighted the value of transparent documentation, rigorous evidence handling, and adherence to ethical standards, demonstrating that even decades-old cases could yield successful prosecutions when legal frameworks were integrated with methodological precision. Beyond the family and procedural team, the broader implications included the validation of modern forensic approaches such as DNA retesting and genealogical analysis, which are now increasingly recognized as essential tools in resolving cold cases. Emily Saunders' story underscored that the consequences of crime extend far beyond the event itself, influencing investigative standards, family dynamics, community awareness, and professional practices in law enforcement and prosecution. The resolution of her case brought long-awaited closure, but the impact remained multidimensional. It affirmed the importance of persistence, technological evolution, and methodological rigor, while demonstrating the enduring influence of a single life on an entire network of relationships, institutions, and community structures. By examining these long-term effects, investigators and legal professionals gained insight into the human, procedural, and social dimensions of unresolved cases, emphasizing that justice is not merely the resolution of a crime, but the restoration of context, understanding, and accountability for those affected. Emily Saunders' life, meticulously reconstructed through diaries, witness accounts, and investigative diligence, became a touchstone for measuring the significance of persistence, illustrating that the ripples of a single unresolved disappearance can inform and improve investigative practices for generations. Ultimately, the long-term impact was not only measured in the closure brought to her family, but also in the systemic, community, and procedural awareness her case fostered, reinforcing that careful attention, empathy, and scientific advancement can converge to overcome even decades of uncertainty and ensure that every aspect of a victim's life is honored through justice and understanding. The resolution of Emily Saunders' case provided a meaningful, restrained closure that reflected both the thoroughness of the investigative process and the careful integration of modern forensic science with decades-old evidence. After 28 years, the confession obtained from the identified suspect aligned precisely with the forensic genealogy results. Trace evidence and reconstructed timelines meticulously compiled by detectives Michael Hayes and Sarah Collins, validating the procedural diligence of both the original investigation and the reinvestigation. The confession was not sensationalized. It was presented factually, demonstrating opportunity, access, and sequence of actions without speculation about motives beyond what could be substantiated. Lab analysts Jennifer Cole and Mark Turner confirmed that the DNA evidence preserved from 1994 and reanalyzed in 2022 provided an irrefutable link that had been impossible at the time of the initial inquiry. Prosecutors Daniel Hayes and Emily Roberts prepared the case for court with exacting attention to ethical standards, ensuring that every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every reconstructed timeline adhered to legal requirements while remaining centered on Emily Saunders' life and humanity. The closure brought to her family was measured and deliberate. Helen Saunders and Thomas Saunders were informed in a manner that preserved dignity and emphasized transparency, allowing them to understand how each step of the investigation led to the resolution. The community, too, received acknowledgement of the procedural efforts, illustrating how meticulous documentation, modern forensic methods, and persistent advocacy can converge to resolve even the oldest cold cases. Closure in this context was not dramatized or overstated. It was rooted in evidence, narrative reconstruction, and the confirmation of fact. The case highlighted the cumulative value of each investigative step. Diary entries, witness recollections, environmental mapping, and preserved forensic material all played roles in transforming decades of uncertainty into a coherent, evidence-based conclusion. Detectives and prosecutors reflected that meaningful closure does not erase trauma, but it provides understanding, accountability, and recognition of the victim's life. Emily Saunders' routine, personality, and interactions, carefully reconstructed over time, informed every element of the case resolution, ensuring that her identity was central to both the investigative narrative and the legal outcome. The restrained presentation of the confession and forensic evidence exemplified the procedural ethos that had guided the investigation from start to finish, emphasizing clarity, factual integrity, and empathy. The community, law enforcement, and family were offered a narrative that allowed comprehension without sensationalism, demonstrating how long-term persistence, scientific advancement, and ethical prosecution can converge to provide justice decades after a crime. Ultimately, the closure achieved in Emily Saunders' case reinforced the principles of disciplined investigation, victim-centered storytelling, and procedural transparency, illustrating that the culmination of decades of diligent work can restore understanding, accountability, and respect for a life disrupted, and in doing so, offer a model for how complex cold cases may be resolved responsibly, thoughtfully, and definitively, honoring both truth and humanity.